Section 4 of Bede's Ecclesiastical History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Bob Srigley. Book 1, Chapter 14. How the Britons, compelled by the great famine, drove the barbarians out of their territories, and soon after there ensued, along with abundance of corn, decay of morals, pestilence, and the downfall of the nation. In the meantime, the aforesaid famine, distressing the Britons more and more, and leaving to posterity a lasting memory of its mischievous effects, obliged many of them to submit themselves to the depredators, though others still held out, putting their trust in God when human help failed. These continually made raids from the mountains, caves, and woods, and at length began to inflict severe losses on their enemies, who had been for so many years plundering the country. The bold Irish robbers thereupon returned home, intending to come again before long. The Picts then settled down in the farthest part of the island, and afterwards remained there, but they did not fail to plunder and harass the Britons from time to time. Now when the ravages of the enemy at length abated, the island began to abound with such plenty of grain as had never been known in any age before. Along with plenty, evil living increased, and this was immediately attended by the taint of all manner of crime, in particular cruelty, hatred of truth, and love of falsehood, insomuch that if any one among them happened to be milder than the rest, and more inclined to truth, all the rest abhorred and persecuted him unrestrainedly, as if he had been the enemy of Britain. Nor were the laity only guilty of these things, but even our Lord's own flock, with its shepherds, casting off the easy yoke of Christ, gave themselves up to drunkenness, enmity, quarrels, strife, envy, and other such sins. In the meantime, on a sudden, a grievous plague fell upon that corrupt generation, which soon destroyed such numbers of them that the living scarcely availed to bury the dead. Yet those that survived could not be recalled from the spiritual death which they had incurred through their sins, either by the death of their friends or the fear of death. Whereupon, not long after, a more severe vengeance for their fearful crimes fell upon the sinful nation. They held a council to determine what was to be done, and where they should seek help to prevent or repel the cruel and frequent incursions of the northern nations, and in concert with their King Vortigern, it was unanimously decided to call the Saxons to their aid from beyond the sea, which, as the event plainly showed, was brought about by the Lord's will, that evil might fall upon them for their wicked deeds. Chapter 15. How the Angles, being invited into Britain, at first drove off the enemy, but not long after, making a league with them, turned their weapons against their allies. In the year of our Lord 449, Marcian, the 46th from Augustus, being made emperor with Valentinian, ruled the empire 7 years. Then the nation of the Angles, or Saxons, being invited by the foresaid king, arrived in Britain with 3 ships of war, and had a place in which to settle assigned to them by the same king in the eastern part of the island, on the pretext of fighting in defence of their country, whilst their real intentions were to conquer it. Accordingly they engaged with the enemy, who were come from the north to give battle, and the Saxons obtained the victory. When the news of their success, and of the fertility of the country, and the cowardice of the Britons, reached their own home, a more considerable fleet was quickly sent over, bringing a greater number of men, and these, being added to the former army, made up an invincible force. The newcomers received of the Britons a place to inhabit among them, upon condition that they should wage war against their enemies for the peace and security of the country, whilst the Britons agreed to furnish them with pay. Those who came over were of the 3 most powerful nations of Germany, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. From the Jutes are descended the people of Kent and of the Isle of Wight, including those in the province of the West-Saxons, who are to this day called Jutes, seated opposite to the Isle of Wight. From the Saxons, that is, the country which is now called Old Saxony, came the East-Saxons, the South-Saxons, and the West-Saxons. From the Angles, that is, the country which is called Angulus, and which is said from that time to have remained desert to this day, between the provinces of the Jutes and the Saxons, are descended the East-Angles, the Midland-Angles, the Marcians, all the race of the Northumbrians, that is, of those nations that dwell on the north side of the river Humber, and the other nations of the Angles. The first commanders are said to have been the two brothers Hengist and Horsa. Of these Horsa was afterwards slain in battle by the Britons, and a monument bearing his name is still in existence in the eastern parts of Kent. They were the sons of Victgilsus, whose father was Witta, son of Vecta, son of Woden, from whose stock the royal race of many provinces traced their descent. In a short time swarms of the aforesaid nations came over into the island, and the foreigners began to increase so much that they became a source of terror to the natives themselves who had invited them. Then, having on a sudden entered into league with the Picts, whom they had by this time repelled by force of arms, they began to turn their weapons against their allies. At first they obliged them to furnish a greater quantity of provisions, and, seeking an occasion of quarrel, protested that unless more plentiful supplies were brought them, they would break the league and ravage all the island. Nor were they backward in putting their threats into execution. In short, the fire kindled by the hands of the pagans proved God's just vengeance for the crimes of the people, not unlike that which, being of old lighted by the Chaldeans, consumed the walls and all the buildings of Jerusalem. For here too, through the agency of the pitiless conqueror, yet by the disposal of the just judge, it ravaged all the neighboring cities and country, spread the conflagration from the eastern to the western sea without any opposition, and overran the whole face of the doomed island. Public as well as private buildings were overturned. The priests were everywhere slain before the altars. No respect was shown for office. The prelates with the people were destroyed with fire and sword, nor were there any left to bury those who had been thus cruelly slaughtered. Some of the miserable remnant, being taken in the mountains, were butchered in heaps. Others, spent with hunger, came forth and submitted themselves to the enemy, to undergo, for the sake of food, perpetual servitude, if they were not killed upon the spot. Some, with sorrowful hearts, fled beyond the seas. Others, remaining in their own country, led a miserable life of terror and anxiety of mind among the mountains, woods, and crags. Chapter 16. How the Britons obtained their first victory over the Angles under the command of Ambrosius, a Roman. When the army of the enemy, having destroyed and dispersed the natives, had returned home to their own settlements, the Britons began by degrees to take heart and gather strength, sallying out of the lurking places where they had concealed themselves, and with one accord imploring the divine help that they might not utterly be destroyed. They had at that time for their leader Ambrosius Aurelianus, a man of worth, who alone by chance of the Roman nation had survived the storm in which his parents, who were of the royal race, had perished. Under him the Britons revived, and offering battle to the victors, by the help of God gained the victory. From that day, sometimes the natives, and sometimes their enemies, prevailed, till the year of the siege of Bede Hill, when they made no small slaughter of those enemies, about 44 years after their arrival in England, but of this hereafter.
Section 7 of Bede's Ecclesiastical History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 34. How Ethelfrid, king of the Northumbrians, having vanquished the nations of the Scots, expelled them from the territories of the English. 603 AD. At this time the brave and ambitious King Ethelfrid governed the kingdom of the Northumbrians, and ravaged the Britons more than all the chiefs of the English, insomuch that he might be compared to Saul of old, king of the Israelites, save only in this, that he was ignorant of divine religion. For he conquered more territories from the Britons than any other chieftain or king, either subduing the inhabitants and making them tributary, or driving them out and planting the English in their places. To him might justly be applied the saying of the patriarch blessing his son in the person of Saul, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf, in the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Hereupon Aidan, king of the Scots that dwell in Britain, being alarmed by his success, came against him with a great and mighty army, but was defeated and fled with a few followers. For almost all his army was cut to pieces at a famous place called Degsaston, that is, Degsa stone, in which battle also Theodbald, brother to Ethelfrid, was killed, with almost all the forces he commanded. This war Ethelfrid brought to an end in the year of our Lord 603, the 11th of his own reign, which lasted 24 years, and the first year of the reign of Phocas, who then was at the head of the Roman Empire. From that time no king of the Scots durst come into Britain to make war on the English, to this day. End of section 7. Recording by David Salisbury, Canterbury, England.